Hey, what's going on, y'all? You are now watching After the Sermon, and my name is Byron. After the Sermon is a podcast resource that Identity Church has put together to go along with the sermons that are being preached on Sunday morning. And I am excited because we went into a new sermon series this past Sunday, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about it. But before we get to it, I'd like to tell you about some of the reasons we started this sermon series, how we got to it, and then some of the challenges in preaching this past Sunday's message. So we started a new sermon series called He Is With Us. And I feel like that has been a theme that I have pushed forward for the last year or so. And over 2024, it became just more and more alive to me as I studied more about God's presence being with his people through his promise. And I think I have rooted a lot of what I've preached in that theme for quite some time, because it's something that I have experienced this year, maybe a year and a half or so. And many of the people in our church have experienced in the last year and a half, where they've felt the nearness of God, or at least for some of them, that the adverse of that, they've wanted to feel the nearness of God or the presence of God, or be assured of the presence of God. And he's been faithful and showing up and allowing for us to experience that together as a body, but also as individuals. And I wanted to spend some time just doing a sermon series about it, because when I was on sabbatical, I read a book called Friendship with God. And it was a really, really good book. I mean, it wasn't like one of those life-changing books, but it was really good, and it helped create the framework for the sermon series. And it's one that will go from Genesis all the way to Revelation, just speaking about God's presence being with his people, especially through his promise. And this Sunday was the first Sunday of that. This past Sunday, was the first Sunday of that sermon series. And let me just say this: I hate introductions to sermon series. Like, I absolutely hate it. I look at it the same way I look at what do you call those? Like when Marvel does the introductory movies. What do they call those? There's a name for it. Can't think of it. But when Marvel does those movies to kind of thrust you into a character, so like the first Iron Man or the first Captain America, there's a name for it. If y'all remember it, put it in the comments. We need some engagement anyway. But that's how I feel about sermon series. So I'm kicking the ball around in my head about how to do better introductions to sermon series. So option one would be, just every time I do a sermon series, I do an introductory sermon to explain what's going to happen in the sermon series. The struggle with that is I tend to foreshadow what's about to come. Like, I have a really good muscle of holding things until it hits. So I'm afraid that in the introductory sermon, I will point to a point that will be covered in a different sermon. People can't get enough Bible. People can't get enough gospel. It's not really a big problem, but that's just one of my thoughts. Another option that I've thought about is doing like a sermon intro video, and not like a sermon bumper, not like in a world far away, like not like, some crazy graphic background or whatever, but just like myself and other leaders in the church sitting down talking about this book, or talking about this topic, or talking about the need, and us in that introductory video sharing why we think this will be valuable, and what people should look out for, and what questions they should ask as we go through the series. That's an idea I've been playing with for quite some time, and I just haven't pressed play on it, but I might just do it for the sake. We have quite a few sermon series coming up this year. I might just try it and see how it goes. And then the last one is to do what we've been doing, which is do like an intro to the sermon series within the first sermon. And I did that this past Sunday. I was not pleased with it. I don't feel like I ever do it well. And my sermon was 51 minutes. I didn't realize it until I hit upload on YouTube, but my sermon was 51 minutes. So if you're watching from Identity, thank you and God bless you for staying tuned in the entire time. Like, we had very few sleep people this past Sunday, and I feel like everybody was locked in, even though we went a little. I went longer than I usually go, but I started in Genesis chapter 2, and I decided to start in Genesis 2 because I didn't want people to get distracted by the 7-day creation process that happens in Genesis chapter 1. The focus of the sermon was God in the garden, and that was actually the title of the sermon. So what I wanted to do was paint a picture of the origin or the foundation of our understanding of us having a relationship with God and us being in his presence. And in that, I wanted us to be able to see that God's original design was that we live in his presence and that he live in our presence, and there be this dual reality, or maybe this conjoined reality of heaven and earth that coexist in some sense. And obviously, if you have a thorough understanding of what God's plan is, we'll get to that point where heaven and earth are one, right? So my last sermon in this series will talk a lot about that, but I wanted to just lay the foundation in this series, and I think I did an okay job. I did not feel like I did a good job or a great job. This was one of those sermons where I felt like there was more questions at the end than there were like hype points, which on one hand, you kind of want that because it's an introductory sermon. Like, it's just the start to get us into this 10-week process of, chiseling at this big theme. The other side of that is I just want people to be confident in the things that they hear on a Sunday. And so yeah, these are raw thoughts that y'all are getting from me right now. Now, as a shepherd and as a leader, as a pastor, I do want to ensure that sermonic time has an understanding that we don't always walk away with a resolution, right? So I think so often, especially in American context, we want to rush past the complexity of the problem, which Genesis 3 rolls out a problem. It's a pretty big one. And it's the problem that will show up in every single page of the Bible, right? Genesis 3 lays the foundation of the problem of sin, and not just sin, but it displays the wrestle between good and evil, right? Before you get to the biting of the apple, forbidden fruit, or the tree of knowledge of good and evil, there is already evil work at play behind the scenes, behind the curtain. But Genesis 3 exposes it and has it leak into the human reality. And I don't want us to be yeah, but we got Jesus coming, that we don't sit in the weightiness of how big the problem is. And I honestly believe that's why there are so many people out there that don't really understand the severity of sin, is because we have so quickly pushed past it to say, yeah, but Jesus dies for your sins. It's not that is not true, but it's just that people should have an understanding of the bad news before they grab and run away with the good news. I know people disagree with that, but I think both elements are there for a reason. And when I talk about sin and evil, I'm not just talking about us doing the salacious bad things. I'm talking about the decision that humanity has always made, and this is the origin of it, to try to take things into their own control, to try to be the masters of their own fate, to try to be the captains of their own soul. And Genesis 2 and 3 lay the foundation of humans being that way, and how our hearts are lured by the possibility of there being a greater reality, opposed to being completely satisfied with the reality that God gives us, right? So I tried to make sure that those elements were there as we unpacked the garden. After our sermon, we do something called reflection and response, and it gives people an opportunity to ask questions about the sermon that was preached or the text that was preached. And this Sunday, reflection and response lasted longer than it ever has. It lasted for an hour and a half, and a lot of the questions came from my description of the garden and the world around the garden and the idea of perfection that I think we're given very early on when people try to tell us this story. So how most of us have heard the story of Genesis 1, 2, and 3 is that God created everything. Everything was perfect. There was nothing that was needed on the earth, that the entire earth was great and perfect. And Adam and Eve lived in perfection, and yet they rejected perfection by taking on the apple or the fruit or whatever. And from that action triggered this darkness coming over the world. And Adam and Eve are the reason why the world is imperfect, because it was perfect before they came and made that decision. Well, when we look at the Bible and we study Genesis 2, and let's even throw in Genesis 1, we study Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 before we get to Genesis 3. What's described is almost these circles of this inner circle of the garden, right? And the garden had all things supplied for it, and it was beautiful and wonderful. But the garden was not complete, although it was perfect. Right. So this is something that I talked about for a decent amount in the sermon, that something can be perfect and yet not be complete. And when I say complete, I mean to its fullest potential. Right. So my wife is the perfect wife for me. I believe that based on my understanding of marriage, based on my understanding of God's sovereignty, based on my choice to make her my wife. But that doesn't mean that she is without some level of improvement that can happen in her life. The garden is described as a place that's perfect and yet not complete. The reason why I think that is what we should grab from there is because the language speaks about what can grow in the garden, that it can bear all of these fruits. It can be, it can grow into just like its fullness. And then notice Adam's job in the garden was to care for the garden and to exercise some level of control over the garden. If you go to Genesis 1, it says that Adam and Eve are supposed to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. That they are essentially to rule and reign over the earth, and that their job of cultivating this space, which we would assume it involves some level of pruning and cutting away and gardening and husbandry, to ensure that things are cared for and appropriate. That if they do that, then there is a need for that work, right? Which when I think of perfect, I think that there's no work that needs to be done, right? And I think that's what a lot of us have always thought of as perfect when we think about the garden, that there's nothing that needs to be done, that we get there and the fruit's already there, and we get there and the margaritas are already poured, or the wine is already poured, or for some of y'all, Diet Coke or Melody, I don't know, but it's already in the glass, or sweet tea is already in a glass, or it's a place of relaxation. And that's not how it's described. So Eden has the potential, it has a reality of perfection, but also a potential of full perfection. And then, the garden, I said Eden, but I meant the garden. Then a bigger circle is Eden. So Eden has a garden, but Eden is not the garden, right? Eden is a place, and the garden is within Eden, but they do not coexist, right? So New York City is in New York, but they are not the same, right? And then outside of Eden is the world. And the way that the language is, God took the dust from outside of Eden and molded man and blew breath in his lungs, and then took the man and placed him in the garden, right? So he goes from outside to inside. And the work that Adam and Eve are supposed to do is supposed to go from inside to outside, right? So like, let's stop for a second and think about Matthew 28, where it's a outward mission, right? That we are supposed to go out and spread the gospel. And we believe, most evangelicals believe, that if you go out to spread the gospel to the ends of the earth, then the goodness of the Lord through the gospel message will go out from the ends of the earth. It's essentially the same call that Adam and Eve are supposed to do something in this garden that's supposed to overflow through Eden out into the world. They punt on that. So here's what we miss if we just say, no, they lived in a perfect world and then they decided to sin. I think what we miss is the calling to participate with God in the perfecting of the earth. Remember, Genesis chapter 1 says that we were made in his image and his likeness, right? So we are made as imagers of him, and we are to act like he acts. What is his act in Genesis chapter 1, or his acts in Genesis chapter 1? He's making, he's molding, he's filling, he's creating spaces for things to flourish. We are to do the same thing all throughout the earth, right? So essentially, Adam and Eve had this opportunity to do really good things in the garden and have that flow out. But that was ended when they decided that they did not want to be imagers, or they did not want to, live like God had called them to live. And they did not want to do the things that God wanted them to do. They wanted to take things on themselves. And that is what created this reality. So I think some of the reason why we don't believe in the fullness of working with God to see this world renewed is because we have relegated it all to perfection and sin. And if we can fix the sin problem, then maybe we can get back to the perfection. But a lot of the perfection, as it's maturing, as it's reaching its, fullness, happens through our work in this earth. Some of that is through us having kids. Some of that is through us making disciples. Some of that is through us caring for the earth. Some of that is through us creating spaces for God's presence to dwell. All of those, I believe, are a part of God's original intention. Yet we do have an enemy, and that enemy is to interrupt that process. And that's what we see in Genesis chapter 3, that there's an adversary and he does not want us to complete this thing. And by him not wanting us to complete this thing, he's also showing us that he does not want us close to God. Because if there is, if we are different from God, if we're living apart from his holiness, then there is going to be dissension. I posit that it's us running from God, not God running from us, right? Sometimes we could use this language when speaking about holiness, which I am a firm believer in God's holiness. Isaiah 6, you in the presence of the Lord, you feel the weight of your sin and you feel the weight of his glory. But I think sometimes we could paint this picture that God is like, I can't be around them. I don't even want them anymore because they're full of sin. And I think it's more so us doing what Adam and Eve did. When we commit sin, we feel shame and we try to cover it up and we walk away from God. And now God's pursuing us saying, hey, Byron, where are you? And we are so afraid of what he might do that we don't realize that he'll do the same thing he did for Adam and Eve. He is more willing to drop the blood of his creation in an animal to create skins to cover us so that we might not feel that shame, and to create a space for us to be reunited, than he is to sit high and just say, bad, bad, bad boy, bad girl. Um, as we go through the series, we'll see how he is angry about sin, and he does not like these things, and his spirit does not want to reign in darkness. But it's beyond like your white lies or dark lies or lust or whatever. It's beyond that. It's more so our commitment to darkness that God is frustrated with. He's angry about, that we would not just punt on choosing him once, but that we would continually punt on choosing him. And yet he offers himself over and over and over. He gives an opportunity for us to experience his presence over and over and over. And yet it's uncomfortable for us. So over the next few weeks, I want us to walk through this slowly. I don't want us to Jesus juke. I want us to walk through it slowly and really understand why God is so relentless in making himself known to us and giving us his presence. Because it's one thing to give us good news, but it's another thing to be in our presence, even as we are living in sin. So some of the other questions that came from Genesis 2 and 3 was, why was the tree put there? If God is loving and caring and he's creating this perfect space for us, why was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil even there? And you don't need me to answer that question. The answer for that question is all throughout, many resources. And ultimately, it's out of love, because love creates opportunity for decision and choice. And if God had not given us that opportunity to love him back, then what are we? We're just puppets. We're just moved by the hand of the master, that we have not chosen to love him. We have been told to love him, but he's given us an opportunity. And even with our faith, we have an opportunity now, all through the scriptures, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, all the way to Matthew, Mark, all the way to 1 John, 2 John, James, Revelation. It's like, choose you this day. Are you going to choose God? Or are you going to choose your own way? Or are you going to choose evil? And that's why that tree is there. Another question that came up in our reflection and response time was us talking about the spiritual beings that might have been in the garden. So we had a long conversation about whether the serpent was just actually a animal who had supernatural powers at the moment, or whether it was the enemy who was using this animal, or if the enemy really put on animal skin. We had that conversation. There are scholars out there that can answer that question for you. But ultimately, I think we laid a decent foundation for this sermon series. And I'm hoping that through the sermon series, we will be able to provide some practical ways for us to practice the presence of God and be more and more aware that he is indeed with us. So if you are not already watching our sermons at Identity, I would love for you to check them out. Not because I'm trying to promote myself, but because I think it would be good to have the opportunity for you to hear those sermons and hear this podcast, and kind of compare the two and see if there are questions that you might have or things that I could have done better in the preaching of the word of God. And we have some guests that are coming soon, and I look forward to being able to sit with them after they preach and talk about some of the things that they experienced during the sermon as well. Other little practical things. The air conditioner it was really hot in there, so I was sweating a lot at the beginning. And we had a packed house, and I'm still getting used to what it's like to have that many people in the room with our new setup. And also, I'm very, very excited about making some changes in how I move to the Lord's Supper. So those are things to look out for. If you've lasted this long, God bless you. I love you. Thank you for watching, and continue to live all of your life in Jesus Christ.